Welcome back to Reasoning Skills. Today we talk about writing sound and effective arguments. First of all, I'd like to wish you well. I hope you and people you love are doing well and that you're finding ways to socially distance yourselves. The final exam is canceled. The grade portion for that will be replaced by counting your top 6 exercise sets. Finally, everyone should have Revel access now. If you don't and you need it, please alert me immediately. Today we're talking about writing an argument. But a lot of this applies to speaking an argument too and making a presentation, and you'll have seen that in your reading. In both contexts, both audience and evidence are really important. In writing or composing an argument, whether through writing text or through speaking an argument, we can build on the skills that we've developed so far in the class in our study of argument. This includes the analysis of argument into premises and conclusion, and also the evaluation of argument. Recall that we use 4 argument tests to evaluate an argument. The first one has to do with evaluating the premise, testing the premise, or the premises. Are they true or acceptable? Audience is super important here because most of the time we won't be able to say whether a claim is completely true, absolutely certainly true. We won't always have ideal evidence for some of our premises. But we may nevertheless be able to provide premises that are acceptable to our audience. And this will vary a bit from one type of audience to another. If you're speaking with your peers, you can assume different things than if you're speaking to a professor, or to your parents, or to some random person on the street, or to somebody in a different culture. We have to keep the audience in mind when we're considering whether our premises will be acceptable. Part of providing acceptable premises can also be making good use of evidence. Often, the audience may not be certain about the truth of some of the premises that we want to use. In this case, we can cite other sources. We can make use of either other writers, we can make use of statistical data, the findings of studies, reports from reputable news agencies. All of these can serve as good evidence, but they have to be backed up by expressing where exactly they came from. Just saying you read it somewhere would not be good evidence. There has to be some sense of where you read it. Consider, for instance, that in recent days, many people have been posting things online saying that dolphins and swans have returned to the city of Venice in Italy because the waters are clear now, given that the industry has shut down. This seems to be the bright line of the terrible tragedy that's going on in Italy. However, it's not true. It is true that the waters have cleared. The waters have cleared because nobody's using the waterways and the muck from underneath isn't being stirred up. But that isn't bringing back dolphins and swans. It's still very polluted, and it takes a long time for an ecosystem to change that dramatically. Reputable sources have reported on the hoax, but you might easily, and many of my friends were taken in by what seemed to be such a happy story about Venice in the middle of the tragedy. So, think about where you're getting your evidence from. We talked about that somewhat earlier in the class. And this is a matter of information literacy that you can also learn more about and will learn more about as you proceed in your university education. The second criterion of, the second test for an argument is its logical strength. How are the premises related to the conclusion? If we assume the premises are true, how much support do they provide for the conclusion? Does the argument claim deductive strength? Or does it claim just probabilistic warrant? Is that accurate? Or perhaps does it claim deductive strength when only it's probable? Or perhaps it claims probable strength when really it's very weak. A further question, a further test, is the test of relevance. In relevance, we ask ourselves about the context of the argument, whether it makes sense to provide these sorts of premises for the particular conclusion. Here, audience will be relevant also, because some matters will be more relevant for certain audiences than for others. If I try to talk to my parents using examples from the internet, they lose interest very quickly, regardless of how good my evidence is or the logical strength I have. I have to take into account what they recognize as relevant. Finally, you can consider circularity. Is it possible that the argument simply assumes the truth of the conclusion? Are no independent reasons provided? These are questions we're going to consider for today's workshop exercise, for this week's workshop exercise. But first we'll talk a little bit about audience and then citation. Our textbook authors recommend, and I agree with this, that when it comes to your assignments, like writing essays, you should check the instructions, see what the professor says. Different professors, and especially professors in different disciplines, may have different expectations. A more general set of expectations for a student paper regarding the audience students are supposed to keep in mind tends to point students either to treating the professor as the audience or treating random classmates as the audience. Now, our textbook suggests you treat the professor as the audience. However, at least in my discipline, in philosophy, it's generally better to treat random classmates as the audience. Part of the reason for that is that you need to show your complete understanding. You need to demonstrate your interpretation. And if you imagine a random classmate, you won't know exactly whether they share the same understanding you do. And that is something you need to consider. Often you need to review evidence and explain background as part of writing an essay. Many essays are composed mostly of explaining material. Even an argumentative essay may only have an argument as a small portion of it, building on the evidence that's been provided, keeping in mind particular audiences like the professor or random classmates. We turn now to citation, and this is the main thing we're going to talk about today. Citation is part of academic integrity, and so we'll talk about why academic integrity matters. We'll talk about academic integrity and how cheating is a violation of academic integrity. In order to understand that, it's good to contrast collaboration with cheating. To avoid cheating and to retain your academic integrity, we will learn some things and review some of your skills with plagiarism and citation, applying the rules. Academic integrity is important. It is a core value in North American education. It's a type of language, the term academic integrity, that's relatively recent. But it captures a range of values that North American and Western education more generally has considered important for hundreds of years. The university, as a general social institution, and particularly the University of Windsor, operates upon this value. Windsor staff, students, and faculty members are expected to protect and to uphold this value. It's part of what allows us to work effectively together. You can explore your particular responsibilities and the expectations of you as a student under the Student Code of Conduct. There you'll see that you're expected to practice personal and academic integrity. You're responsible for your own personal and academic commitments. And that you should gain fair, cooperative, and honest inquiry and learning. So the difference between collaboration and cheating is unclear to some students. Think about this for a minute. What is cheating? Not just academic cheating. Whether it's collaboration or cheating to work with another person depends on the nature and purpose of the assignment, the rules of the game, or the social rules, how we understand the social order to work. If you break the rules intentionally, then you're cheating. And you are expected as a university student to understand the rules of the university, including that you don't get to collaborate unless you have specific permission. It will depend on the instructions, though. Sometimes I encourage students in my class to collaborate, and I have had some great essays that were written jointly by students. The general rule is know what the professor expects, what is to be done by the group, if there's group work, and what is to be done individually. Note that I've cited here C. Lipson as articulating this general rule. One form of cheating is plagiarism. In the most general terms, plagiarism is using someone else's work as your own. More specifically, it is using someone's words or ideas or thoughts or data as your own. That's a lot of different things. It also involves failing to properly attribute the source of the information you use. Here are some other forms of plagiarism. Submitting the same work in 2 different courses. Now, you might think it's perfectly reasonable to submit one essay in 2 classes. But the university prohibits that. It's against the rules. Now, whether or not you think the rules are correct, the fact is you have an agreement with the university to give you credit according to their rules, and you are obligated to follow them. Secondly, if you submit work identical to another student's work without permission, and I'm sure you're fairly familiar with this, copying off other students. I'm not saying you do it, No, I'm not saying you do it. I'm sure you've heard of this. I'm sure you've heard of this. Well, this is not just a general practice. This is also made explicit in university policy, and you are responsible for upholding that. So why do people plagiarize? Well, you know, I used to be bewildered by it. But I've learned a fair bit in the decades now that I've been a professor. And I know that sometimes it's just that students don't understand what constitutes plagiarism. This is part of the reason that I am stressing this in today's class. Now you know, or by the time we're finished, you'll have a pretty strong understanding, and one that takes many people many years to develop. Time issues can be a problem too. I know when I am behind on a deadline, I have occasionally fantasized about buying work from somebody else that I could submit. And the internet makes it very, very tempting. However, the internet also makes it super easy to catch plagiarizers. I catch people all the time. Not every year. It depends on what classes I'm teaching, but when I'm teaching essay classes, I regularly catch people cheating, and I hate it. I wish it didn't happen. It makes me very, very sad, but I am vigilant about it. Thirdly, it can be simply that your research writing, citation, or organizational skills are poor. Plagiarism can happen because you didn't set yourself up properly. You took notes, but you didn't point out, you didn't write down for yourself where your notes came from, what the source was. And then you go back and you try to find it, and you can't find it. Now, the internet also gives you ways around that, but it can take a lot of time if you haven't set yourself up well. So make keeping track of your sources a priority when you're writing a paper. It will help you make sure that you don't plagiarize. So the next thing we're going to do is talk about citation. This is a way of avoiding one form of plagiarism. That is not the sort where you cite another student, or you cite where you copy from another student, or somebody copies from you, and not the form where you hand in a piece of work in more than one course. But this is the more common form, which is when students use written material or spoken material in the context of their essay that they've taken from the media in general or from publications without providing credit. So the question is, when do you need to cite? Because sure, we use material from other people. That is part of belonging to a culture. We get to learn from other people. We get to borrow from other people. But you need to cite when you use a passage word for word. You also need to cite when you paraphrase. Now let me stop for a second. Some of you may be confused between citation and quotation. Quotation is when you put quotation marks around material that the exact words of which you have borrowed from somebody else. When you use a passage word for word like that, you certainly should put quotation marks around it. But that's not enough. You also need to cite it. You need to indicate who said it in what publication. Often you need to include a page number or other reference point too, but that varies by discipline to discipline. Because some people confuse quotation and citation, they don't realize that when you paraphrase, when you put somebody else's ideas into your own words, you still need to cite. You don't need to quote. You couldn't quote, it's your words, but it's their ideas, and you still need to cite. You also must cite when you borrow someone's ideas. Or even when you simply refer to someone's work. If you say, I really like the view that daylight savings time is bad for people's health. If you refer to the idea by saying you like the idea, you need to indicate where you heard it, where it comes from. You should also indicate when you were influenced by somebody's ideas. Now we're going to do a bit of an exercise. In class, I would have had you do this on your own and then we would review it. Now you can pause the video so you can, if you want more time to think about it, but I will also give you, say, 30 seconds to think about it, maybe 15 seconds to think about each slide. The exercise is on should you cite? Consider this passage from our textbook, from Faccioni and Gittins 15.1. They say, effective writers do not write for themselves, they write for their audience. An effective writer seeks to establish a relationship grounded in trust. Before putting pen to paper, the audience must think critically about the intended audience. Who will be reading or hearing this? How shall I get the audience's attention and keep it? How shall I express my arguments to this audience in the most effective way possible? Is the audience friendly or hostile to the position I am going to take? Will this be my only chance to communicate to this audience? Now imagine that having read this, as you all have, you, in some of your own writing for a university course, say the following, in quotation marks, effective writers do not write for themselves, they write for their audience. Do you need to cite? Yes, you do need to cite here. Just having put quotation marks around is not enough. You also need to indicate that Faccioni and Gittins are the ones who said this, word for word. Here's another example. The exact same passage that we're keeping in mind from Faccioni and Gittins. Consider that in an essay you've written for university, you say, effective writers do not write for themselves, they write for their audience. Well, this is taken from the first two sentences directly, or the first sentence, which has two components. It's word for word. And so certainly you should both put quotation marks around it and add a citation. Here's another example, drawing on the same passage from Faccioni and Gittins. Consider that in something you are writing, you say, effective writers write for their audience. Do you need to cite this? This is, in fact, extracted from the very top part of the original passage. It really summarizes the second part of that first sentence. And so you certainly would want to cite this. You might even want to put quotation marks around write for their audience. Or you could put an ellipsis, 3 dots, between writers and write, and then put quotation marks at either end of this sentence, and add a citation. That would be ideal. That would be fully responsible academic integrity. Here's another example. Consider that you have said in your paper, effective writers seek to establish a relationship grounded in trust. Again, this is directly taken this time from the second sentence, and you should put quotations around it and cite it. So we've seen some pretty simple examples. Now they're going to get a little more complicated. Consider that you've put in your essay, effective writers ask themselves how to engage the audience. You need to cite this one too, because you borrowed the central idea of this paragraph and simply paraphrased it, distilled it, put it in your own words, but it's the idea that comes from Faccioni and Gittins. Even if you had thought about this before, and even if you would have used the language of effective writers before and engaging the audience before you read this book, if you read it published by Faccioni and Gittins, you need to give them credit. You need to show that the idea has been published by them before you wrote your essay. A further example. This example draws directly from the original passage too. This time it draws directly from the second last sentence. Is the audience friendly or hostile to the position I'm going to take? And it interprets it in the context being about effective writers, and these being the sorts of questions effective writers ask of themselves, the sorts of considerations they make. And it just puts it into the student's or the writer's own words. You would certainly need to cite Faccioni and Gittins, although you wouldn't want to quote here. Well, you could quote under the audience is friendly or hostile. You could put quotation marks around that. There is a general rule for how big a passage needs to be in order to put quotation marks around it. Any passage that is, 3 to 5 words directly taken from another source should be attributed to that source. Anything bigger than that, 3 to 5. Now, if the words are very ordinary words, like maybe you'll go up to 5 words. But if the words are more particular, like effective writer, which is a type of language that's only used in certain sorts of scholarship, like the scholarship about critical thinking, that sort of technical language generally can demand students put quotation marks around it. Probably not just the phrase effective writers, it's only 2 words. But the audience is friendly or hostile, that is a pretty detailed, sophisticated description that you might want to put quotation marks around. You certainly should cite it. Another example. Here, based on the Faccioni and Gittins excerpt, we're going to consider that you are saying, considering whether the audience is positively or negatively disposed toward you will help you write well. Do you need to cite if you say this? Yes, you do. You need to cite this. You need for this information to be recognized as drawing on the understanding expressed again in the second last sentence about the friendliness or hostility of the audience. All you've done is rephrase this here in terms of being positively or negatively disposed. A further example. Consider that you say, I disagree that a writer needs to consider whether the audience is positively or negatively disposed. Here you also need to cite. You've expressed a disagreement. You've suggested that somebody else has expressed this idea, and you are situating yourselves relative to them. So you need to tell the audience who these people are that you disagree with. Otherwise, it won't be clear. This is one of the things about academic integrity, is that it's not just a moral responsibility to give somebody credit. It also helps us understand the world better, or it helps us give other people a better understanding of the world. If you show me where you got your understanding from, then I am better able to appreciate the context in which you're working, and maybe I will follow up. Consider now that in your paper you've just said, audiences may be hostile. You do need to cite this. Well, you ought to cite this. If you've been reading Faccioni and Gittins and you've seen them have this discussion, then you ought to. You may consider it common knowledge that audiences are hostile, sure. But if you have read it in Faccioni and Gittins, then you need to give them credit for having discussed it in a publication. Another example. Hostility is a serious problem facing any writer these days. Do you need to cite this one? The answer is maybe. Maybe. It's not clear that Faccioni and Gittins are talking about the state of public discourse right now. They are talking about writing in general and effective writing. So perhaps this is a different topic, but you might want to be safe and cite anyway. The general rule is, if in doubt, cite. A further example. You've read this Faccioni and Gittins passage, and now you say in your essay, Readers may experience a range of emotions. Do you need to cite this? No, you don't need to cite this. This is an observation about readers. Now, perhaps you've read somewhere else discussion of how readers experience emotion, but this claim is much more general than the discussion by Faccioni and Gittins of friendly and hostile audiences for effective writers. It is so general that you can freely say something like this without citing it. Another example. You say in your essay, capturing an audience's interest is not easy. No, you don't need to cite this. There's nothing in this passage about it being difficult or easy. Sure, the passage is about capturing an audience's interest, but that's just the topic. That's not specific to Faccioni and Gittins. This is something that you may be claiming for yourself. So when is citation not required? When stating common knowledge. Now, figuring out what common knowledge is quite difficult. This takes time. And it is helped by knowing who your audience is. This is something you develop with time and education. But for now, that is one reason that we ask you to treat a random classmate as your audience. You should treat as common knowledge anything that you could expect any member, all members of the class, to already understand. Citation is also not required when expressing your own thoughts and ideas in your own words. You don't have to find a source for ideas that are yours. You also don't have to cite when analyzing or synthesizing the material you have researched and previously cited. That is, if you've just spent a paragraph summarizing Faccioni and Gittins, you can then refer back to it without having to cite it again. Also, when you have provided evidence and information and drawn conclusions and provided your own opinion, you don't have to cite yourself as you proceed. Here are some examples of common knowledge. René Descartes was a famous philosopher. Now, some of you may not know that, but you may have heard the phrase cogito ergo sum, or I think therefore I am. That is the insight that he is known for, and it is common knowledge for many people, although it may not be to you. There are 10 provinces in Canada and 3 territories. That you should know, right? That should be common knowledge. Many animal rights advocates are vegetarians. That's also common knowledge. The smartest students at the university take courses in philosophy? Well, I certainly think that's the case, and perhaps you'll come to be of that mind too, although maybe it's not really common knowledge. Yeah, it's just a bad joke. How to cite? The basic rule for citation is, if in doubt, cite. Cite. Finally, if you would like more advice on writing, I recommend this book to you, They Say, I Say, The Moves That Matter in Academic Writing by Gerald Graff and Kathy Birkenstein. I recommend this to students at all levels, including graduate students, and they find it quite useful. In fact, I learned some things by reading it. These are people at the top of their field in terms of teaching people how to write in an academic style, and they cover different disciplines as well as providing you with general advice. And it's available quite inexpensively. Now we proceed to this week's exercise. Recall the question we asked in the first class. Most of you were there. If you weren't, just accompany us in thinking about this subject now. What do you value? Consider it again. Has it changed since January? Maybe it has. A lot of things have changed, and you've been learning. And also our values can shift a bit from day to day. Some things become more important and others less important. This is the word cloud of the things that you value. The exercise is to ask yourself, first, what reasons would you give to persuade another member of the class to share one of your values? Now, I've been talking about academic integrity. And so the example I'm going to give you for your homework today, the example of how to do a question like this, is going to be based on how I would argue for the value of academic integrity. Academic integrity is a value that supports a number of practices for giving credit to other authors. See, in that sentence, I have defined what I take academic integrity to be. And I've given it a title, The Value of Academic Integrity. I proceed in my next couple of sentences. Giving people credit they have earned is valuable because it shows respect for them and honors the quality of their work. In addition to having that moral significance, academic integrity helps to create knowledge because it helps the reader or audience to know where the material or ideas come from. So I've given two reasons here. The first one is in the middle sentence, that giving people credit for work that they've done shows respect for them, honors the quality of their work. I describe at the beginning of that last sentence that that is a moral consideration, respecting people. Think about what counts as a moral value: respecting people, treating them well, taking other people's health and welfare and interests into consideration. These are all moral concerns, matters of moral value. But my second reason, which is marked by the words in addition to having that moral significance, I show that I'm taking a different line of reasoning. I say academic integrity helps to create knowledge because it helps the reader or audience know where the material or ideas come from. In talking about knowledge, I'm talking about values that we think of as epistemic, is the language we use in philosophy, regarding truth and cognition and understanding. So it's a different kind of value, having true beliefs. So these are two sorts of ways that you can argue for the value of something. You can use moral reasons, as I do in the second sentence, or you can use epistemic reasons, as I do in the last sentence. There are other types of values too. There are political values, and that covers probably most things: political, moral, and epistemological. The next step in your exercise is for you to apply the 4 argument tests to your argument. First, are the premises true? Well, my premises have to do with the fact that academic integrity is a moral value, and it also helps people gain knowledge. I have provided some backup for the claim that it provides knowledge by talking about truth and understanding. And I have also explained that it has moral value because it provides respect for other people. So I have some sub-arguments there. And they make the premises, I think, reasonably strong because they don't just stand on their own. So I would say they're strong premises. What kind of logical strength does this have? Well, the logical strength is going to be probabilistic. It's certainly not deductive. Well, maybe it is. Maybe you would consider it deductive, but I would like to say it's only probabilistic. You may have reason to doubt the value of academic integrity, and perhaps the reasons I've given aren't sufficient to convince you. Perhaps they're not sufficient to say that academic integrity in general is valuable. Maybe it only says certain aspects of academic integrity are valuable. Therefore, it would be probabilistic. With regard to the relevance test, I would maintain that I have shown a good deal of relevance because I have explained in detail how both understanding and the moral value of responsibility are brought into my discussion and how they strengthen the premises. And so this provides relevance for my argument. The final question is circularity. Is my argument circular? I don't think it is. If I had said something like, academic integrity is valuable because everybody thinks it's important and it's really good, then I would be arguing circularly, because saying it's important and good are just synonyms for saying it's valuable. I haven't actually added any kind of separate evidence. I haven't broken down the ideas or found any kind of way to explain why I think it's valuable. And the final touch on this exercise is for you to ask yourself, how good was your argument? And it really doesn't matter if you provide a bad argument. The most important thing is, do you analyze it properly? Do you use these tests well? You get 1 point for each of the 4 tests, and then at the end you have to say whether you think your argument is good or not. Well, I think my argument's pretty good. I think it's about as good as moral arguments get in a few words. Sure, if I were writing several pages, I could come up with a stronger argument. But for a short argument, it's pretty strong. So that's the end of the material for today. But here's an indication of what's coming up in the remainder of the class. On Wednesday by 8 p.m., you should finish the 15.1 and 15.2 quizzes in Revel. Then you have several more days until Saturday, the 28th of March, to complete this exercise that I've just been discussing. And I'm about to post it on Blackboard. So that will take you through this second last week of material. Around that time, I will also be posting the material for the very last week. And we will have a few more things that you can see in the updated schedule that I have sent around. But the first thing in the last week will be Wednesday, April 1st by 8 p.m. You will need to finish quizzes in Revel in chapter 16. Now, I have not selected those yet. Those have not been assigned to you yet, but I will be getting to that by this Friday for sure, so that you can work ahead. Thanks very much. Again, be good to each other. Breathe deeply. It's a really hard time. And I will be in contact electronically. Bye.